Hello everybody, my name is Caitlin Myers. This presentation is going to be over George Marsden's work, The Outrageous Idea of Christian Scholarship. Despite its title, his book is actually a defense on Christian scholarship and its perspectives in academia. Now, what does he mean whenever he says that Christian scholarship is treated as outrageous? By this, he means that Christian scholarship tends to be more discriminated against in academia and considered an approach that isn't unempirical enough. He views it as something that is treated as if it is a biased perspective. Now, this, he argues, is a bit hypocritical because the mainline perspective, which rejects the idea of religion in academia, is in itself a biased perspective. This, he argues, is a problem that academia faces by trying to embrace scholarship that remains completely neutral. They actually end up doing the opposite by rejecting ideas that go against the mainstream teaching. Now, he argues that although some of these ideas that are outside what the mainstream accepts as factual or legitimate, that these perspectives are still important to consider in order to avoid discriminatory policies and in order to keep an open mind. That if science cannot approach the world in a way that isn't biased, that is open-minded, then they're going to fall into their own biases and their own overlookings. Now, he does go over times whenever Christian scholarships are allowed and are not treated as outrageous. However, he notes that this tends to only be inside of Christian universities or Christian institutions. This, he says, is a bit problematic because it limits Christian minds to only going into universities like that. And some of them may have studies that need to be inside of universities that do not embrace these perspectives. And whenever they are not allowed into the general line of thinking, it limits them in their growth. Now, he goes on to also argue about an opposite problem that goes on in scholarship, and that is the idea of pluralism. Now, pluralism, while it does integrate the idea of Christian scholarship as a legitimate perspective and study, it also does that with every single religion and spiritual outlook. This, he says, can also be a bit problematic whenever it comes to Christian scholarship, because Christianity rejects the idea of other religions and spiritualities having a legitimate set on the stage of academia. He does not say that they should limit other religions in this perspective, but he does say that the Christian perspective should be considered in this and taken seriously as a science as well. Now, the methodological naturalism and idea of neutral objectivity is a bit of a limited perspective, even though it tries not to be. He addresses the fact that there isn't a way to completely avoid having some form of bias or some form of limitation when addressing different types of scholarship in academia. But he stresses the importance of allowing Christian scholarship to have its place in the world of academia outside of Christian institutions. Marsden's work reflects his ideas and what he's experienced as a Christian. Part of the reason that he writes over this and has such a defense over Christian scholarship is because of what he himself experienced inside of his own studies. He noted different times in academia whenever he felt like he was treated as an outsider because of his perspective, or his perspective was treated as illegitimate because of the religion that he approached from. He also noted that he felt that there was a specific bias against Christianity in general. Now, this may stem from Christian beliefs being contradictory to some other belief systems. However, this, he said, still wasn't right in the line of discrimination. He notes that religious discrimination should not be allowed inside of academia, just like discrimination against genders and race shouldn't be allowed. As a whole, Marsden argues that academia work to reflect a viewpoint that allows all perspectives. That doesn't mean that it needs to necessarily agree with all perspectives or treat all perspectives as realistic, but that it should be open enough that all perspectives are allowed to share their thoughts. He also goes on to argue on some of the problems that Christian academics face, that a lot of them who have a Christian perspective do not feel that they themselves belong outside of Christian universities. This, he says, is a challenge that they need to learn to overcome and to understand that being presented with the idea of other religions' outlooks or even non-religious outlooks does not need to make them directly shy away from that form of academia. He knows that it's important for Christians also to keep an open mind in scholarship and to look at other approaches, to consider other perspectives, and to include these inside of their studies and their research so that they themselves are doing the same thing that they expect of others, that they are researching with a fair and unbiased approach to academia.